My name is Michael Bailey. I'm an Android engineer at American Express. You can find me on Twitter at YogurtEarl. And today we're going to be talking about Android Studio tips and tricks. First, a quick plug for my company. I've been working there a long time. It's a great company to work for. We're hiring engineers across the spectrum in lots of locations for lots of different teams. So check us out on our website if you're interested. All right, so Android Studio. If you've been doing Android development for a very long time, you might remember there was a thing before Android Studio called ADT, which was a plugin for Eclipse. In 2013, they announced that they were switching away from Eclipse, which was an open source platform, to use IntelliJ as the base for their new IDE. But IntelliJ is also open source platform that they build Android Studio on top of. There's a lot of other IDEs that are also built on the IntelliJ platform. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today actually will work across languages in different IDEs. So if you have to do development in Rust or Golang or Ruby or JavaScript or one of the other languages that there's an IntelliJ-based IDE for, a lot of the things that I'm describing here today will also work in those contexts. So by investing in learning in these, if you have to do polyglot development, where you're switching between different types of code bases, different languages, you can have that same familiarity with keyboard shortcuts and the way that the IDE works. So it's one less thing for your brain to switch between. If you're switching between editors, plus switching between languages, plus switching between projects, that's a lot of cognitive overhead. So by having a same editor across all these and having similar concepts work across languages, you can definitely ease the transition between languages and code bases if you need to do that. So the investment that you do in learning this tool will also help you in those other tools. And as a developer, it's important to know your tools well, and that's why I'm giving you some of these tips and tricks. You'll never know all the bells and whistles of any environment you're in. They're all very complex, but if you learn little by little over time, you'll grow that knowledge. So if you've used other IntelliJ-based products, like the base open source edition, you know that it's versioned by year and they have 3 releases a year. So there's a way to tell which version of IntelliJ Android Studio is based on, and it's this number at the beginning of the build number of Android Studio. So this version of Android Studio 3.6 Canary 5 is based on 2019.1, so you'll see very similar features with IntelliJ 2019.1. If you look at 3.6 Canary 6, which came out yesterday, you'll actually notice that this is 192. So as of Canary 6, they've rebased on top of IntelliJ 2019.2. So periodically, you'll notice UI shifts in Android Studio. Sometimes that comes from the underlying IntelliJ platform that they've moved to a newer version on. So on the previous screenshot, you saw that I was using a Canary version of Android Studio. So Android Studio generally ships 3 channels. They ship the stable channel, which if you're starting out, you want to start with stable. If you have a smaller project and you're not as adventurous, you can just stick with stable. Stable is always has the fewest bugs and less experimental features. But there's a couple of reasons that you want to try either beta channel or Canary channel. One is to try the new features that are coming up in future releases and be able to provide feedback to those through filing issues or additional feature requests. The other is, for your specific project, the new versions of the Android Gradle plugin and the new versions of Android Studio might have issues that only occur in your projects or only a subset of projects that they might not be aware of unless you file them. And if you file them during the Canary cycle, in my experience, you're a lot likely to get a quicker fix and get the fix in before it becomes stable. If you don't file it, it may go stable, and there may be this one issue that prevents you from upgrading, and you can't take advantage of the latest stuff when it goes stable. So a good workflow is to have one or maybe a handful of people on your team try out the latest beta and Canary until they run into issues, and then they can go back to stable. But before you go back to stable, file the issue so that it can be fixed by the next time it goes to stable. And you can have multiple versions installed at once, so you can easily switch back to stable if you run into an issue with Canary, and then try Canary again in maybe a couple weeks when maybe that issue is fixed for you. So it's a great way to make sure that the upcoming stable versions will work well for your specific project. So if you're doing this workflow where you occasionally jump over to Canary to see if it works well with your project, one of the things that you want to think about is which version of the Android Gradle plugin that you're using. So you've got Android Studio, and the Android Studio doesn't necessarily have to be using the exact same version of the Android Gradle plugin. Android Studio will work with any previous stable version. So even if I'm using the Canary of 3.6, it will still work with the stable version of the Gradle plugin, which right now is 3.4. But if you're going to use a unstable version, you need to match it up exactly. So if I'm using 3.6, Canary 6 of Android Studio, and I'm not using a stable version, then I need to be using 3.6 Alpha 5 of the Gradle plugin to match. And you also want to test those out in concert to make sure that the Gradle plugin also works with your project. But by doing this, if you're going into your actual source code and switching out the versions in your source code, you might accidentally commit that change, and you don't want to commit a Canary version to your whole team. Then you have to go into Git and revert it. So one way of handling that is to put different versions in your source tree and then use a toggle that's outside of your source tree to switch the version. So in this case, we just have two versions there, either the latest version of Android Gradle plugin or the stable version, which is 3.4. And then in your home directory under Gradle properties, you would set a property that says use the latest version of agp.equals true. Your project picks that up. So you can just toggle that without actually having a file that's in your project change that you might accidentally commit. And you can take this one step further by not only saying, is it the latest or is it the stable, you can actually just say stable, beta, and alpha, and rather than have a true or false, you could pick from multiple versions if you need to be able to switch back and forth. So if you're coming from another editor, other than IntelliJ, other than Android Studio, the keystrokes are going to be a little bit different. If you really don't want to make the jump to the new keystrokes, they do have other key maps that are available for you. I recommend taking advantage of the IntelliJ keystrokes and learning those, because some of the keystrokes don't map. There may be features that don't have easy keystrokes in the other ones just because those features didn't exist in those other editors, so you may be missing out on some things in IntelliJ. One thing to note that in older versions of Android Studio, the default key map was Mac OS X. In the new version, it's Mac OS X 10.5 Plus, which has less conflicts with some of the things in the operating system. So I recommend using that one. It's the default now. But if you're on an older project that had that key map set in the project settings, you may actually notice that the keystrokes are different between projects if you're jumping between projects. So make sure you check which key map you have if you notice differences in which keystrokes are working, and there's various differences there. If you come from a Vim background, you'll know that Vim is more than just a simple key mapping. So there's a plugin that will give you the different modes of Vim and all of the stuff that Vim brings into Android Studio or other things based on the IntelliJ open source platform. So check that out if you really want to bring Vim into IntelliJ and get the richness that IntelliJ brings in terms of understanding your Android project, but you also want the familiarity of Vim. One thing to note that is if you customize your Vim setup, you're going to need to migrate some of those settings to .idea Vim RC if you want those settings to show up in IDEA Vim. All right, so if you have one of the newer MacBooks, you are familiar with the touch bar, which for better or worse, maybe not always be the most convenient thing when you're trying to program. One of the things you'll notice is that the function keys don't always show up there, and a lot of keystrokes in IntelliJ or Android Studio and other editors use the function keys. So then you have to remember to hold down the function key plus whatever combination of keystrokes you have, and then that's going to probably be different than when you're using a physical keyboard. So especially if you're going back and forth between a physical external keyboard and the MacBook keyboard, you want to have those function keys always available. And so there's a way to set that. So if you come into System Settings and you find Keyboard under System Settings, and then you go to Shortcuts, and you come down here to function keys, you'll notice there's a list of applications here. And those applications listed there, when those applications are in the foreground, the touch bar will always be showing the function keys. So if you look here, when I have Android Studio in the foreground, you can see my touch bar has these custom keys and not the function keys. But if I come in here and I choose Android Studio Canary, and I add that there, now I have Android Studio Canary in that list. And now when I have in Android Studio in the foreground, it will always have the function keys there without me having to press function. So another thing I recommend you trying is not using tabs. And I'm not talking about like white space tabs, spaces versus white space, although you should also not use tabs in that context. But in this context, I'm talking about editor tabs. When you open a file, kind of like Chrome, you have lots of tabs for each website you have open. In Android Studio, by default, you'll have a tab for each file that you've recently opened. And you can switch where that file is, but one of the options is actually to say, I don't want tabs at all. And then you might say, well, how do I switch between files? So if we look at the editor tabs here, you can toggle it to none. And you'll see there's no tabs up here at the top. Actually, let me open this. So this is where you can set it to none. But then you can use Command E to see all of the recently accessed files. And not only can you don't have to grab the mouse like you would with tabs. So one of the things with tabs is every time you have to go and search for that file that you're looking for, not only do you have to grab the mouse, but you also have to kind of do this linear search for like, oh, I just recently opened that file, where is it? And you're kind of looking around, especially if you have a lot of tabs open. This way, you can use just the keyboard to switch between things with Command E, but also in any Android Studio dialog, you can just start typing to filter through any lists that are there. So let's say I know I'm looking for app module or something like that, I can just start typing app module, and it will filter all of the recently opened files for that, so I can quickly get to that. The other thing that you can do when you're searching in Android Studio is it will use camel case. So if I just know that it's app module, I can type AM, and it will find the first letters of the capitalized words in the name of that file and filter by that. The other thing you can do with Command E is find the various tool panes around. So if I wanted to go open the terminal, I can go find it, or I can just type term, I can do terminal, and that will open the terminal down at the bottom. So no tabs is something that takes getting used to, but try it for like a week and just try using Command E and see if you don't miss tabs and see if you find it more productive. At first, you're going to always be wondering, where's my tabs? But you'll get used to it. So if you used older versions of Android Studio, you'll notice that the Gradle sync window has changed. Let me do a Gradle sync here. So when Gradle loads your project, it will run your project files to understand what modules you have and what configuration you have and what dependencies you have. In the newer versions of Android Studio, they introduced this tree hierarchy view, which can sometimes be hard to understand what's going on because it's very nested and you have to go kind of open these things and try to figure out what's going on. So it's sometimes less intuitive. You can come over here and say toggle view, and it will take you back to the old text-based view where you can just see a list of things. So if you're used to that older view, you can still access it. And actually, I'm running 3.6 Canary 5 here. In 3.6 Canary 6 that was released yesterday, they actually have this in a split view. So it's no longer toggle one or the other. You kind of get both side by side. But that's in the Canary view. So if you're still using stable, you can still use this toggle. But eventually when 3.6 goes stable, you won't need to do that anymore. Another thing is if your project grows is you might want to give Android Studio more memory. Otherwise, you're going to really get a lot of slowdowns as it garbage collects and tries to understand your whole project. It's a trade-off because you want to give Android Studio enough memory that it's not constantly garbage collecting, but you don't want to give it too much memory because then it's competing with other things on your computer like Chrome or Slack or the Gradle daemon or the Kotlin daemon. There's a lot of things, the emulator, that use memory. So you don't want to have Android Studio competing for that, but you also don't want to give it too little. So there's a couple things you can do to kind of understand what's going on here. In newer versions, I think 3.5 and later, you actually might see a pop-up that says, hey, you might want to increase your memory. So Android Studio might suggest a memory amount for you. In the current stable version 3.4, it doesn't automatically suggest that for you. So you have to go manually set it. So one way to figure out what you might want to set it to is there's a thing called the memory indicator. So if you say show memory indicator here under window options, that's going to show this little thing down in the corner, which shows you some statistics about how much memory Android Studio is using. So you can see the max heap size is set to about 3,000 megabytes, how much is allocated, how much is actually used. And now if I click on this amount, if I click on it, it's actually going to force a garbage collection. And you can see now I'm only using 302. But if you watch this over time and you notice that it's getting towards the max, you probably don't have enough memory. You can see for this particular project, I have plenty of memory because this is a small project that I have open. And I probably don't need 3,000 megabytes for this particular project. But I have other bigger projects that do need that much. Unfortunately, it's not a project-by-project setting. It's a overall Android Studio setting. So you may want to change it as you're moving between different projects. Or just keep it at the biggest one you need for the biggest project that you typically work on. So once you determine, like, oh, OK, it looks like I probably need maybe 2,000 megabytes, 3,000 megabytes, then you can come in here under Help, and you go to Edit Custom VM Options. And you're going to put there an argument for the Java VM. So when you run Java from the command line, it's the same syntax that you would pass into Java there. Here I'm setting it to 3,072 megabytes. And this is X means it's an extension option, and the max, that means it's the max amount of memory that it will use. So you can always change this by coming in here, editing that, and then restarting Android Studio. And then you can monitor down here to see if you're getting too close to the limit. If you have a really big project, there's even another thing you can do to help with the performance of Android Studio. And this is kind of drastic, so it really only applies to very big projects, but it's called unloading modules. And so you can come into a load unload module screen. And this project I have is fairly small. There's only the root module and then the application module. But you can say unload all, and then if you have just a subset of the app that you're going to be working on right now, you can then just reload the ones that you want to load. Now, there's a lot of downsides to doing this, meaning that when a module is unloaded, Android Studio will not know anything about it. It won't show up in search results. It's not going to show up in refactorings. So it's not going to compile if it needed that source code to compile the module that you're working on. So there's a lot of downsides to doing that. But if you have a really big project and you've modularized in a way where certain parts of the app can be built, and maybe you can run the unit tests on just a set of modules without having to need these other modules for compilation, you can exclude those from Android Studio, and it will help Android Studio work a lot faster. So something to consider. You will run into some pain points with that, but it just depends on which the pain is worse. You have a really large project that Android Studio is super slow in, or you unload a few modules, which has some downsides as well. So if you've been using Android Studio, again, for some time, you will have noticed that at some point, the default for the project tool window changed. This is the tool window I'm talking about over here. The default now is the Android view, which groups things by like types of files. So I see my manifests, I see my Java source files, I see Gradle scripts all grouped nicely, which definitely has its advantages. But if you're used to the older style, which the original way that they had this was just project view, and this just maps directly to the hierarchy that you have in your file system, it always defaults to Android view when you open a new project. And so if you're jumping between projects, you might always have to be coming and switching back to project view for each project. There's a way to tell it to always use project view by default. And so if you come up to help and you say edit custom properties, and then you say studio.projectView equals true, then when you open a new project, it's going to default to project view, which is what Android Studio used to do. So if you're used to that and you always want it to come up with that by default, you can add this to your Android Studio's properties. All right, find action. So you may have noticed that I used this before when I was finding the load unload modules. So if you hit Shift-Command-A, it brings up a find action dialog. And this is searching all of the IDE actions. So all the stuff in these menus up here, plus a lot of other stuff that is not in those menus, you can search for by name if you don't remember which menu it's under. As they add features to Android Studio, it becomes harder and harder to just go through menus looking for the options that you have. You can also search preferences will show up in these, and you can actually toggle preferences. For example, the show memory indicator, I can actually just right in here toggle it on and off. You can see down at the bottom corner it's appearing and disappearing as I toggle this by pressing enter. So you can toggle preferences that way. You can access features like the load unload modules. And load unload modules, let's say that's something that I'm constantly trying to balance which ones are loaded and I need to bring that up a lot. By default, there's no keystroke for load unload modules. Well, if you find something in this menu and you want to add a keystroke because you know you're going to be using it a lot, you can highlight it and then you press Alt-Enter when it's highlighted, and it'll allow you to assign a keystroke right there. So I'm going to hit Alt-Enter. And now for load unload modules, I'm going to try to find a key mapping that's not already mapped. So maybe Control-Command-M. And so that's not already mapped. If I had chosen something that was already mapped, like Shift-Command-M, it will tell you, oh, that's already assigned to these other functionalities, so maybe I don't want to choose that keystroke. But Control-Command-M for modules is not mapped. So then I could say OK, and it would add that as a keystroke there. And so now if I do Control-Command-M, it brings up the module dialog. So find action is great for finding things that you don't remember where they are, and then if you think it's a common thing that you're going to do a lot, you can assign a keystroke to get to it right from this dialog. So one thing to be aware of is if you're running OS Mojave, they introduced a new OS level keystroke that could conflict with this find action keystroke. So when you're trying to do Command-Shift-A, it might pop up a terminal. And if you're wondering why it pops up a terminal on OS Mojave, it's because they introduced this keyboard shortcut. So if you come into keyboard, you go to shortcuts, you go to services, then you scroll down, you're going to see that there is, oh, I must have remapped this last night. So this by default is Shift-Command-A. So you can either just toggle it off altogether, so there's no keystroke for that one, or you can come in here and map that to something else if you actually use that functionality. So if you're not on Mojave yet and you switched and you do upgrade to Mojave, be aware of that. Resource Manager is a relatively new feature. It either came in 3.3 or 3.4 to Android Studio. And previous to this, there was a feature called Show Thumbnails, which would just show a list of all the bitmaps in your project. It was pretty limited view. Resource Manager is a lot more comprehensive in what it does. And you can find it either by using Command-Shift-A Resource Manager and opening it that way. You can also use Command-E and find the Resource Manager that way because it's a tool window. You can open it that way. Or it's also over here on the side under Project. And so this is going to give you a view of all the resources, the visual resources in your project. So you have your drawables, your colors, your layouts, and your maps. So for things that have more than one version, if you have different configurations, MDPI, HDPI, XHDPI, etc., it will allow you to see all of those different configurations, and I can just click that to open that specific version of the IC launcher icon. You can come in here, you can create new images, vectors from this. You can switch modules that you want to look at. Then you can also show libraries. So here it's going to show me, if I click show libraries up here in this little filter icon, it's then going to show me the assets from all the libraries that I have. So if I'm trying to figure out something specific about AppCompat and I want to look through their versions or see, oh, they have 4 versions of this file, or they only have 1 version of this file, and why is it showing up the way it is? You can kind of dig through libraries using this. They have colors that come out of libraries as well, so you can dig through some of those things from the Android X libraries. All right, so another thing I wanted to talk about was font ligatures. So ligatures are when you take 2 symbols that are 2 characters, that are logically 2 characters in your file, but they're displayed as 1 character in the editor. And you need font support for this. You also need editor support for this. So if you set it all up, you essentially, for these examples, instead of a exclamation point equals, which as developers we know that means not equals, but this also means dot equals, and this is more of a, it kind of makes more sense just to look at than an exclamation point equals. Also for an arrow, we use dash greater than in Kotlin. Here it'll actually turn it into an actual error. So there's an arrow. There's a couple things you need to do to get this set up and working. First, you need to find a font file that has ligatures included in it. And there's a couple ways to do that. There's some that come pre-coded, loaded with that. Fear code is one. You can also, if you really have a favorite monospace font that you use for programming, you can use this tool called Ligaturizer that will take an existing font file and add the ligatures that you need to enable this into that font file, and then you can use that. Once you have the font file, you need to be able to go into Settings and look at ligatures. And so you have to pick the font that has ligatures. So Inconsolata G is one that I use as a code font. It has ligatures added to that specific font. So I set that as the font. And then you have to also say enable font ligatures. And the combination of those two will give you font ligatures in the file. So you can see here's the example that I had in the slides. It's really 2 characters, even though it looks like 1. And if I put a space there, you can see that it's really 2 characters, exclamation point and equals. But without the space, it combines it into something that is easier to read. Same with the arrow. So semantic highlighting is a feature where IntelliJ is aware of, or Android Studio is aware of the syntax of the file that you're in. And so you can use Alt up and down to syntactically select inward and outward on scope. So I'm pressing Alt up and down here, so it'll select the contents of the string, the outside of the string, the whole attribute, the whole element, the body of the parent element, and the parent element itself. And then if you press down, it reduces the scope there. So if you quickly need to select something and then move it, this is a good way to select that or copy or paste based on the logical structure. This works in XML files, this works in code, and again, this is going to work not just in Android Studio, but any other sort of language in an IntelliJ-based IDE. Once you have something selected, you can then move it around as a group, and IntelliJ is smart about knowing what makes sense to move. So if I just was to move this one line, you can do Command-Shift to move one line. That doesn't really make any sense. This is not valid XML anymore. But if I select this, and then I move it as a whole, IntelliJ knows to not just put this variable line in the middle of this other variable tag. It's smart enough to know that that won't be valid XML. So it will actually move it around. It'll change the indents as you move it around. But it's smart in terms of moving things around and keeping it syntactically valid. So there's a lot of things you can learn. You can learn these keystrokes all the time. You'll never know them all. But one way to see how much this is benefiting you is a thing called the productivity guide. You can go up to help in the menu and say productivity guide, and it's going to tell you how many times you've used each feature, how many character strokes it saved you, how many bug fixes it's done for you with the quick fixes, and then for each one you can highlight it, and down at the bottom it'll actually tell you what that feature does. And so you can use this as a way to learning features. Here I have it sorted by most used. If you can also sort it the other way to see like least used, so you can see things in the editor that you've never used, and then look through those, see what might be useful, and maybe put those on your list of things to practice deliberately or learn. So IntelliJ has a feature called Inject language. And this allows you to have a different syntax embedded within a larger syntax. So in this is a Kotlin file, but we also have regular expression syntax embedded into it. And for certain things, it's going to automatically know that it expects a regex, and it'll automatically be highlighted as such. So in this method, it knows that pattern.compile always takes a regex, and it's going to highlight that as such. But if there's a place where it doesn't highlight that, you can actually do Alt-Enter, which is kind of the magic keystroke to tell you all of the things that are relevant in that construct, in that context. Put your cursor in lots of different places, and you'll discover some cool IDE features by just hitting Alt-Enter. In this case, you can inject a language or a reference. So I can tell IntelliJ that this is a regex. I'm going to say this is a regex. So now it changed the syntax highlighting, as you can see. And then you can also, now that it knows it's a regex, you can check regex. So I can say that's not going to be a match because it needs to be a numeric. But if I put that, okay, my regex is doing what I expect it. So if you're building a regex, you can quickly just check it right in the editor with different tests. Although you might want to then encode those in unit tests after you've kind of tweaked your regex to where you want it to be. The other thing you can do with any sort of thing is it's sometimes hard to edit, especially a big thing like this, in the context of a Kotlin file, because you've got to have escapes both at the regex level, you have to have escapes at the Kotlin level, so sometimes you need the double escape, sometimes you just need the single escape, and so it can be a little bit confusing on what you need to escape. So if you do Alt-Enter, and you say Edit regex fragment, and this will work on other language injections as well, but it will open a separate window. You can see down here that it's now opened this in a window that's purely the regex. I don't have to worry about the Kotlin syntax. So especially if you're going between languages and you don't know exactly how things need to be escaped in JavaScript or Rust or whatever, this can be very helpful because I can just type what I need down here. So if I type a single quotes, that maps to a backslash single quotes because it knows in a Kotlin file within a string that you need the backslash there. It also knows that when I want \s, which is a space character and a regex, I need to escape that as well. So I can then edit it down here, and you can see it'll edit it up here kind of in real time, except it'll actually do the proper escaping that I need. Oops. So one thing you probably are aware of is the ability to command click. But you can also, and I would argue it's more convenient, is to just do command B. And now command B in this case will take you to the interface definition. But also you might want to go and see the actual implementation, not just where the interface is defined. So you can do command Alt B will tell you the different implementations of that method. It will search across your code base. So in this case, this is generated by Room. So I can actually go and see what code Room has generated for this method. And then I can do Command Alt Left to get back to where I was. So any of these things that allow you to navigate, you might kind of go down a rabbit hole, navigate into different other files to try to figure out what's going on. But then you want to kind of go back to where you were. I can go into the file with the Command B. I might again go into something here, but then if I do Alt Command Left, it'll take me back to where I was, and again, it'll take me back to where I was. So you can kind of pop all of those edit locations off of the stack. And I think that's all I have time for today. So that's my Android Studio tips and tricks.